Chapter 3.6 Art of Renaissance and Baroque Europe. So the term Renaissance basically means rebirth. It's a reference to renewed interest in classical world of Greece and Rome. So it's kind of going back to those old ideas. The subject matter, you see a lot of mythology. The Renaissance was also marked by an interest in education, the ideas of the natural world. So humanism became influential as a philosophy. A lot of these artists were looking at the classical world and promoting that idea of individuality. And so the idea of reflection of their gifts from God. And so we're going to see where the role of the artist even changes. In the Middle Ages, everything that was painted, like everything was very celestial, everything was up in the heavens. And during the Renaissance, everything is brought to earth. So it's here on earth instead of seeing images where they're like in these unworldly places up in the heavens and stuff like that. We'll also see how the Reformation and Reformation greatly impacts art as well. So in the Italian Renaissance, Catholics believed that the church was often the patron. So you would see images of like saints, priests, and stuff like that. So these, you'd see a lot of frescoes as well. Whereas in Northern Renaissance, this was more Protestant belief. So they're moving away from the church. And so in these, you're going to see clothed figures, more everyday figures, and then a lot of symbolism in the work as well. We'll also look at some of the characteristics of Baroque art. And so because of the increased trade and science, a lot of these artists are also being influenced by the outside world, right? And then so the division between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants play a big role as well. There is a lot of motion and emotion in the Baroque, which we had never seen before. And so the artwork really changes into the Baroque period. So we start at the early Renaissance in Italy. So with this renewed interest in the classical, we also see where artists are developing a system of perspective, right? This is the first time that they understand perspective. And so a lot of this science and math is playing a big role in art, because now you're looking at this artwork where their purpose was to create this realistic depictions of the three-dimensional world, and then creating the space, creating this perspective, and creating this real and this ideal, right? And so a lot of these figures that we'll see, they're idealistic nudes, going back to classical, right, to the Greek gods and stuff like that. So when we see some of these paintings, they are painted as these idealistic nude figures. This is Giotto. This is part of a series of frescoes in Italy. And so with this, you will see some of the characteristics of Renaissance art. So the figures have substantial mass. They don't look flat anymore, which in the Middle Ages, the figures looked very flat. They had no sense of depth, no sense of mass. You'll also see a narrative, right, which is actually telling us a story through gestures, through expressions, even like the faces have expressions. And so this is very different than what anybody had seen. So this is the Florence Cathedral, and this is one of the biggest game changers, I guess, in art, was Brunelleschi's design, right? So the Florence Cathedral was built and they couldn't figure out the dome. And so if you can imagine, like, this dome is, the church is built, the cathedral is built, but the dome, they haven't figured out how to build it. So they have this competition to design the dome, and Brunelleschi was the one who discovered this. So he becomes like the first Renaissance architect. But it was actually a really like great technical challenge. It was an amazing feat that he came up with. And so the fact that he built this building, and also built the equipment. He built a hoist. He actually invented all of the things that he needed for this idea. And so this system that used each stage of the structure to support the next, right? And so the first structure supports the second structure, the third, and so it just keeps supporting itself until it meets on the very top. The construction took 16 years. But with this idea, a lot of people were paying attention to Brunelleschi, and they're talking to him about his ideas and this idea of perspective and space. And so here we see Masaccio. He was one of Brunelleschi's friends, and he creates this believable illusion of 3D space, right? And again, like in the Renaissance, this is a game changer, because in the Middle Ages, we didn't see stuff like this. The images were flat. They had no depth. They had no mass. Even like the proportions, everything was really weird. But in the Renaissance, this is where these artists are changing, and their understanding of the real world changes. And so we see this in their artwork. The use of atmospheric perspective, where it looks like it goes on forever, right? So that there's actual space, that illusion of space. The continuous narrative, right? So we see the same individuals in this picture. And so we see Peter here and then also in the back. And so it's like a story where Jesus, the taxpayer is asking Jesus for money for taxes, collecting taxes. And then Jesus tells Peter to go get the money from the fish. And so he goes out to the water, grabs the fish, pulls the money out of his mouth, and then comes and he pays the taxpayer. And so this idea of this continuous narrative had not been seen before. So this is also something that the Renaissance brought to us. In the High Renaissance in Italy, this is in the beginning of the 16th century, we see the great Italian artists dominate this period. So we're talking about Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. They utilize perspective, the idea of illusionism, so the idea that you're looking at the real world in front of you. So it was almost like they're looking through a window and painting exactly what they saw, and making you believe that what you're looking at is really the outside world, right? And so most of their patronage is from the Catholic Church, right? And so a lot of their influences was from classical architecture as well. So in the High Renaissance, we see Raphael, for example, with the School of Athens, and really taking in these new ideas of like humanism and stuff like that, the influences of science, the arts. And so in this piece right here, the School of Athens, we see all these great thinkers, right? And so like, for example, we see Plato here. He's modeled after Leonardo da Vinci. We see Aristotle right next to him. In the bottom, we see Hercules and modeled after Michelangelo. So he's taking these great thinkers and then painting them as these 16th century artists. He even includes himself, a self-portrait of Raphael, and he paints himself in here. And so the idea that he's putting these artists with these great philosophers, these great thinkers, scientists, that they also have that same wisdom, that same knowledge that all these great thinkers, and so that they do belong in this world, that they're more than just craftsmen, right? And so this is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. And when you look at Michelangelo's work, the depth and the illusionism of that reality, these figures are idealized, yes, but they also look very realistic. And so he was commissioned by Pope Julius II, and he really preferred sculpting versus painting. And so the idea of these figures really look very sculptural. And so as he painted the Sistine Chapel, they say that some of these were almost like studies for his sculptures. And so he was like thinking about sculpture as he was doing these paintings. So 20 years after the Sistine Chapel was painted, Michelangelo was commissioned again. He's already in his 60s, and he's commissioned to do the Last Judgment. And so in this image, you see the blessed and the damned souls that are facing their last moments on earth. And then you also see kind of this like chaotic reflection of uncertainty of the late Renaissance, right? And so if you look closely, you'll see like all these souls that are being damned, and then the ones that are being blessed and being pulled up to heaven. But if we look closer into this middle section, we see where Michelangelo creates his self-portrait. And in that self-portrait, he paints himself as St. Bartholomew's skin. And so St. Bartholomew was flayed, and so basically his skin was cut off of his body while he was alive. And so Michelangelo paints himself as this this skin of Bartholomew. And a lot of questions would be like, well, why would he paint himself as this flayed skin, like just being hung there? And so a lot of possible meanings that have arisen from this is the idea that he was very dissatisfied with painting, and the fact that he spent so many years painting where he would rather be doing his sculptural projects that he never got to see done. But then also something deeper also was the idea of references to his homosexuality. So if you think about, he's being commissioned by the Pope, and already knowing that the church thoughts on this, he's being judged. And so the idea of his fear of that judgment and what is going to happen to him. And so maybe parts of that in itself, a lot of art historians believe that it was a reference to his homosexuality. The Renaissance in Northern Europe was different. They were less concerned with these idealized figures. They didn't care really too much about perspective. The use of symbolism was really important. And so the idea of fine details and glazing as well. So, for example, here, the moneylender and his wife, this is more about Christian morality. The shopkeeper is counting his coins. The wife is trying to read her Bible, and then, being distracted by this materialism, right? And so that again is like trying to keep these like morals in these paintings. But the figures don't look as realistic as we see like in the High Renaissance, and this idea of illusionism, that wasn't important to them. In the late Renaissance, we see the idea of mannerism, and so in these compositions, they're more chaotic. There's a lot of emotion in it. There's a lot of intensity. These pieces were more about imagination over believability. In the High Renaissance, a lot of the compositions were stable. But here in mannerism, they're very unstable compositions. You have a lot of overly muscular figures that don't look very realistic. They're very elongated. But those emotions play to the exaggerated effect, right? So this sense of anxiety and disorder in the piece itself, where in Italian Renaissance, they were very orderly. There wasn't that much expression. And so it was very kind of stoic. In Italian Baroque, we're going to see the emphasis on light and these kind of theatrical dynamics. There's a lot of movement in the compositions, and there's some intense emotion as well. This is Narcissus by Caravaggio. And so here we see tenebrism, this use of dramatic lights and intense darkness. In Narcissus, he thought himself to be beautiful, and he died because he couldn't stop looking at himself. So that heightened emotion is a great example of Baroque. The Northern Baroque has the same characteristics as Italian Baroque, except that here Baroque painters and Northern Baroque painters also excelled in the depiction of non-religious subject matter. Peter Paul Rubens, for example, 4 studies of a head of a Moor. And in Baroque art, you also saw these strong diagonals and the emphasis on the lighting again, darks and lights, very theatrical.